Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Terry Kimball, President and CEO of the Chandler Chamber, and I want to do a shout out and thank my colleagues from the Ahwatukee, Apache Junction, Carefree Cave Creek, of course, Chandler, Fountain Hills, Gilbert, Queen Creek, and Tempe Chambers of Commerce for our weekly session on question and answers with our area experts in helping to navigate as we reopen and what those types of things look like. Today I have with me Michelle Gray with Integra HR Consulting, and as well as Michael Garza with Payroll Control Systems from the payroll side to talk about things, and Paula Whitcomb with the SBDC because there are continuing more and more questions on PPP and EIDL loans, and we're here to hopefully bring you all of those answers. Just a reminder that please use your chat box. All of the presenters will go ahead and answer those as we continue throughout this morning's program. So let me go ahead and I'm going to kick it off with Michael Garza from Payroll Control Systems. So thank you, Michael, for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to kind of walking you through a few things here and try and get to some questions as much as we possibly can, because I'm sure there are quite a few of them out there. But hopefully you'll find this helpful, and looking forward to talking with you all. Next. So the CARES Act, it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. A lot of us at this point know a lot about the CARES Act. It involves a lot of information and gathering of data to be able to apply for a lot of the loans that have been available. And there's, of course, a lot of pieces that have been involved. So from HR to payroll to accounting, finance, your CPA, your tax accountant, and even your attorney needed to be involved. So what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about, of course, how payroll is involved. We'll talk about how HR is directly involved. And then, of course, now that things are kind of in motion, what do we do now? So that's the overall goal. So next. So what is the CARES Act? It's basically a relief package to help struggling and displaced workers during the pandemic. It kind of ties into unemployment, healthcare and benefits, employee retention tax credits, deferred Social Security tax payments, of course, the Paycheck Protection Program, and then the FFCRA. Now, a lot of us, of course, have heard a lot of information that's been going on out there. So with unemployment, for example, in the state of Arizona, the maximum amount of unemployment per week is $240. And then the federal government has kicked in an additional $600. So there's a total of $840 that's available from an unemployment perspective. That's tied to this this CARES Act. And it really has been a huge help for those of us that know people who have been more affected by what's happening than the others. So our goal is to kind of dive into a few of these things that hopefully pertain to what you're looking for. So next. So the Paycheck Protection Program, that's probably the biggest thing that people are talking about, at least in my world. There's been two rounds that have gone through right now, and we're hoping that there is a third, especially for our 501c6 friends out there, like the Chandler Chamber of Commerce and other chambers that haven't been able to take advantage of it. But what it basically says is that a business can get up to 2.5 or 2.5 times, I should say, of their employer's average monthly payroll cost. There is a cap at 10 million. What they did is they've looked back from 1 year from the loan. Of course, it involves payroll, it involves benefits, rent, mortgage, utilities, and then again, nonprofits, 501c3s have been able to take advantage of it. And as I mentioned, 501c6s have not. Now, the loan proceeds are used to cover payroll costs, as I mentioned, and then a few of the other things as well. What I'll talk a little bit about is the payroll side of things. And the caveat is that employee headcount and pay levels are maintained, and it's an 8-week period that begins on the date that the lender makes the initial distribution of the business. It includes salaries and wages, Commissions and tips up to $100,000 of the annualized for each employee. Your employee benefits, of course, include paid leave, severance pay, insurance premiums, and the retirement benefits. State and local taxes assessed on the pay, and then, of course, payroll costs also include for sole proprietors, independent contractors for their wages, commissions, income, or net earnings from self-employment up to $100,000 overall. One of the things I'll talk about with the tax deferments that are available is employers, all employers and self-employed individuals are allowed to defer payment of their employer's share of the Social Security tax, which is 6.2% of their Social Security of the employee's wages. The provisions require that the deferred employment tax be paid over the following 2 years, with half the amount required to be paid December 31st of 2021, and then the other half by December 31st of 2022. It also provides a refundable payroll tax credit of 50% of the wages paid by employers to employees, of course, during the COVID-19 crisis. This credit is available to employers whose, one, operations were fully or partially suspended due to COVID-19 related shutdown, or their gross receipts declined by more than 50% when compared to the same quarter in the prior year. So there have been quite a few businesses that have been affected by it. So one of the key things that people who have had to apply for the loan that have been extremely important, of course, is gathering of the data that's needed for the loan itself. And then one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later, of course, is that once the 8-week period is done, it's going to be extremely important to continue to report the information that you're utilizing it for, so the portions of the bill, of the loan that is forgivable can be forgiven. Next. I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to focus on the HR impact. So, the payroll side has a lot to do with the data, and where I'm seeing is employers are asking more about, what do we do in these situations? And there's a lot going on. So the areas I want to really talk about, the first one, of course, is the FFCRA, which is the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. Many of you are aware that, there was 2 things that were under that, which came under, of course, the CARES Act. The emergency sick leave, what does that provide? It provides up to 80 hours of time off paid for an employee if they are, have the virus, got the corona, and are sick, and the doctor or there's a state mandate that took them out. The expanded FMLA, which I've gotten a lot of questions on, is what part of that? What if we already have FMLA? Is this in addition to? And the answer, no, there's not in addition to. It is part of the FMLA. It's specifically for childcare or school closure. So if you don't have childcare because of right now the shutdown, or those places that are still shut down, or school, of course, was closed, it would allow an employee to take 2/3 of their pay. The first 2 weeks, they can use the emergency sick leave, and then the up to additional 10. If they are under FMLA, they want to make sure if they've used some under their employer and their company is part of FMLA, they're subject to that they haven't used FMLA in a rolling period, or how the company has that policy in place. So there's different things that take place in that. I am seeing a lot of questions that says, can you deny pay? It depends. I have seen where an employee wants to come back, but their doctor has said you still have some exposure, or we want you to have an additional 3-4 days. You want to err on the side, again, of the employee, giving them that time. And if they have emergency sick leave still, you want to go ahead and take a look and say, let's go ahead and pay for that portion of it, because, again, you want to be careful what the doctor's orders are. Furloughs versus layoffs. There's some confusion out there about, well, if my employer furloughed me, what does that mean? Am I terminated? Versus the layoff. So layoff, you're not with the company anymore. The company does not have to bring you back in, but there could be questions on that. If furlough, you are still an employee. You're just kind of temporarily on leave. At that point, without pay, most of the time is what happens. So right now what we're seeing is if an employee refuses to return to work, so as here in the state of Arizona, a lot of employers have gone back and they're requesting their employees to return. So we're hearing everything from, I'm afraid to come back, I have underlying conditions, I don't want to go back till I know that the state is fully okay and all orders have been lifted. If the employee refuses, one of the things is you want to take a look at, is there any condition? Is the employee requesting because they have an underlying situation? So review that before you say, I'm sorry, but you're terminated. Number two, if the employee does refuse and they're just afraid versus, hey, I have this situation or my child is not, there's no daycare, then they're pretty much resigning is what happens. So it's a resignation. The other thing you want to report that is if they do refuse and they are not going to come back to work, then you're going to report that to unemployment because their unemployment could potentially be denied. A lot of employees right now that are on furlough or layoffs and get called back, they're not aware that their unemployment could be denied. So that's something to take into consideration. Also be very cautious about, again, not asking too many questions, protecting the ADA part of it, but at the same time, making sure that there is a potential reason why they're not going to return or why they can't return at this time. The other thing that's come up is remote workers. So right now, several organizations have allowed their employees to work remotely if the position has that capability. So how do you manage employees currently are still either remote working or you want to bring them back and they're saying, hey, I really like to work from home. I think it's been better for me. I'm more productive. Take a look at that. Make sure you're being consistent. You can allow a worker to continue to work remote if the position allows and the company policy says, hey, we're seeing this to be very successful on that. How do you discipline a remote worker? You would discipline them the exact same way as if they were internal. What's happening though is everything is done via communication. If you're able to bring them in the office and have a sit down, if those are always better to do it one-on-one in person, but if not, you want to make sure that you're following your company policies. Discipline doesn't change whether they're working from home or they're working in the office or at another location. Your same policies are still in place. You also have to be careful with remote workers is that you're following your OSHA guidelines, your workers' comp guidelines, also, ADA. So when someone is at home, the protocols for policies are still there, security with the system. So we're seeing sometimes where an employee is using their personal system because the company didn't have enough, but there may be some cross information where they are taking company information is now in their personal system. That comes in disciplinary potentials if they're doing it on purpose and the employer finds out that they're taking company information. So again, remote workers are still treated exactly the same as if they were in the office. There is not a difference. So don't be afraid also to manage your employees that are working remotely. Last, safety. So right now goes back to, well, my company's wanting us to return. What are the safety requirements? My company's requiring me to wear masks. Do I have to? Or my company's telling me, no, we're not going to provide masks. Depends on the situation. One, you want to look at the position. You also want to look at, is the company putting safety requirements, following the CDC guidelines? That is the biggest thing that employers really should be looking at is what's best practice? Are we following the CDC guidelines? But we're also looking at what's the right thing for our guests and our clients as well that come in, all of our customers. So look at, the amount of space, so distancing, staggering positions, and shift work potentially. So these are things that can allow an employee to feel safe when they come back to work, making sure you have those. If an employee wants to wear a mask, allow them to wear a mask. Now, if they're in a position, let's just say that they're all by themselves and there's nobody else around, that's where you want to say, okay, does this person have to wear a mask? Now, if they want to, absolutely allow them to do that unless it's something that would, kind of limit them based on the job. But be very careful, talk with your counsel if you're looking at what, by enforcing, and make sure you're consistent across the board. Next. So So what's next? The biggest things is, having a good tracking system, following the act. So there's the CARES Act, and as Michael had mentioned earlier, there's all these various pieces under the CARES Act. The biggest piece when it comes to watching for discrimination, paying attention to ADA, OSHA guidelines, as well as the National Labor Relations Act. A lot of people don't realize that, oh, well, we're not a union, this doesn't apply to us. Well, if you're violating potential safety policies and guidelines and employees bringing those concerns, that is something you have to be careful, because they could bring some concerns to the organization that the company is not protecting from a safety standard. Be consistent in your policies. So don't do for one or say you have to do this, but not for the other. Make sure it's based on the position, it's based on the department or the company as a whole. Don't be afraid to act. What I mean by that is I'm hearing a lot where companies and managers are coming and going, I'm afraid to discipline somebody because we're having a performance issue, but it's unrelated to COVID. They have not been sick. What do I do? Can I still move forward? Absolutely, but make sure there is not a perception. That is the biggest thing. That's the big area of gray that we talk about, is the perception. What do we do? So talk with if you have HR internally, if you have someone who manages employee relations, look at the case, look at the timing, what has been going on prior to this specific time that they're going to be talked to, or, hey, performance improvement. What's on the horizon, for possible lawsuits? I'm listening to a lot of things. Right now, the biggest fear that employers are having is, oh my gosh, if I deny this, or what if an employee gets sick? We didn't put something in place, but we're doing everything we can. We have to keep an eye on lawsuits. They are going to be on the horizon, but it's what practices and what are we being consistent with? Are we putting policies in place? Are we tracking everything that we're doing? Yes, we're in a day of time where we do have to track our stuff. We have to note it, but we also have to take into consideration, what is the employee's situation? As we said at the beginning, there is no such thing as one size fits all. Everything is a case by case, and then there's the law. So we have to make sure that case by case that we're reviewing them. Make sure you reach out to your internal team. A lot of this, and again, we wanted to provide as much information in this short period of time, but when it comes to employees and employers, it's always about being open, make sure communication, listen to your employees, make sure employees are following the policy before making decisions too, that things are documented. If you don't have an internal team like your counsel or HR or payroll, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to listen. We can provide some information. We can also provide resources to go to. And I know we had a couple questions, and I do apologize. I was trying to not miss anything. So I want to make sure we kind of go through some questions that people may have.
Actually, Michelle, why don't we wait? Let's have Paula, because I think some of the stuff that Paula's also going to talk, and we'll take the questions at the end. So we'll keep them, keep coming. So this is great information. And actually on our last week's call, where Paula was talking about PPP and the EIDL loans and some of the tracking things that you have to have, it really kind of flows in together as well. So Paula?
All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. So just very briefly this morning, I want to speak to the PPP loan forgiveness update. So if you could go to the next slide. So if you're not aware, they have actually released now the application for the PPP loan forgiveness. And you can find that application in two places. So the first location, you can go to the U.S. Department of Treasury. I've got the link there on the slide. And you're going to click on that CARES Act off of the main page. And when you get to the CARES Act page, if you just scroll down, you're going to find it under a listing for borrowers called Loan Forgiveness Application. Could you just go to the next slide quickly for me? So this is a screenshot from the U.S. Treasury website. So when you get to that CARES Act page, if you scroll down, there's a section that says for borrowers, and I've highlighted there. In this case, it's labeled the Loan Forgiveness Application. So that's one location to find it. And then if you would go back to our previous slide, the other location you can find the same documentation is at the SBA.gov website. And here, if you simply follow the PPP loan program links, you will eventually get to that loan program page. And the document is a PDF document again, and they've labeled it the PPP loan forgiveness instructions and application. So if you're inclined to, you can find the same document in either location. So if you go to one of those, you're going to find the same documentation. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And actually one more. So I'm not going to get into any details about that application. If you've actually gone and downloaded and looked at it, your head probably started spinning very quickly. It is not an easy form or application, but for today, I just wanted to briefly overview what is in there. So first of all, there are several items. There's a loan forgiveness calculation form and instructions. There's a PPP Schedule A form and instructions, a PPP Schedule A worksheet with instructions, and then there's another document that literally lists all the documentation that you may need to provide. So if you're getting flashbacks to tax season, it kind of definitely has that flavor. Schedules, forms, and instructions. So my recommendation to you is it is a lot of information. If you do have a PPP loan, we've not quite hit that first 8-week time frame when some of you are going to hit your 8 weeks. Just know that in our conversations with the SBA, it's not as if the day after you hit the 8 weeks, you're not going to have to submit that documentation right away. Okay, there's going to be some lag time. So just take a deep breath, right? You're going to have a little bit of time to submit the documentation. I would suggest download the forms. And if you really want to look at anything, I think the most helpful thing to start would be with the worksheet where it's labeled that PPP Schedule A worksheet. In there, it gives you a table where you're going to have to start listing your staff and their status of full-time, part-time, and where you list the salary information. So I would just encourage you to kind of look at that worksheet. And if you've not started documenting, that might be a good format to just start documenting and getting ready. The second recommendation would be just to take a look at that documents list that's in there and begin to gather some of that documentation. Obviously, we've talked about the supporting documentation for payroll. But if you're doing things like paying rent, mortgage interest, utilities, it's not just showing the proof that you've made that payment over the 8-week time frame, but in some cases, it also lists documentation needed to prove that that was actually in place. I think it's that January date, that COVID date that they have in the application, that you'll have to show documentation that maybe that rent agreement was in place, or you've been paying those utilities for a certain amount of time. So read through that documents list and start to gather that. I think that would be 2 valuable kind of easy steps to ease into and get ready for the forgiveness process. Next slide, please. And here again, I just want to remind everyone, I was reviewing the forgiveness application yesterday in detail, and they are very clear and very concise about the use of funds. So make sure you're using the funds 75% for payroll, 25% for rent, mortgage interest, and utilities. We're still hearing from some clients and just some anecdotal stories about business owners using it for things outside of this, but that forgiveness application is very clear about the use of the funds, and it's also very clear about the penalties of misusing those funds. So just a cautionary note, just be mindful of that. And just continue to keep those detailed records and supporting documentation. Just get in there, run your business, manage your business, and take these initial steps. And as we're getting ready for the forgiveness phase to start. So next slide. Just as a reminder, the Maricopa Small Business Development Center, we are here, we provide no fee counseling to our small businesses. If you need help with anything related to these disaster loans, we can provide that assistance. And in addition, you see on the screen here, many of the other areas that we help our clients with. So click to the next slide, please. If you are interested in counseling services, all you need to do is go to our maricopa-sbdc.com webpage and complete a request for counseling form. It takes all of about 30 seconds to a minute to fill out the form, and that will get you assigned to a lead counselor who will contact you for an initial session to talk about not just your needs related to the disaster loans, but business in general as we move into the recovery phase. So, and I think that was it, except for our contact information at the end.
Well, thank you, presenters. We've got some questions here, so keep the questions flowing. This question came in the FFCRA. I have 5 employees. Do I have to pay this to the employees?
So yes, there is some limitations if you are under 50 employees. If there is a financial hardship that you can show that says, hey, my company, is not going to comply with that. As of, when the FFCRA went into place, it was, yes, that employers should be complying with that. So even with 5 employees, if you have someone that is out and says, I'm going to be out due to COVID, I just found out that, I wasn't feeling well, went to the doctor, I got tested, and I have the virus, or I was exposed, would they be paid for that time off? Unless they can show otherwise why they would be exempt from that. Right now, the answer is yes.
Okay. Were there specific leave forms from the Department of Labor created specifically for COVID?
So, like specific types of, read the question, I apologize, Terry, if there's
Sure.
specific forms.
Were there specific leave forms from DOL created specifically for COVID?
So I have found some forms. Myself, I did not find them. I've searched. Where I have located some leave forms is actually on the SHRM Society for Human Resource.org. Also, there are several organizations and HR League. I know PCS has a system that they use that have created forms. So they've kind of been created based on some guidelines that have been put in place.
Great. Okay, next question. What steps do I have to follow if I have to lay off or eliminate a position? Are there forms? What do I give to the employee?
Would want to give them a letter, and it depends if you're doing a layoff, which they mentioned layoff, but also again, just make sure you're determining if you're doing a layoff or a furlough. Either one, there are some forms that are available. I do have those. I've received a few of them. A lot of the resources that some payroll companies have. Also, just be cautious too, that when you're out there looking on the wonderful World Wide Web, that there are forms that can be written that do not have correct terminology or laws or things that are in there that could get you in trouble. So making sure that you're either going to your general counsel, your attorney that deals with employment law, you're looking at organizations like PCS who have some resources. You're going to areas even within the chamber that may have some resources as well. SHRM.org has wonderful resources where I go and I gather a lot of my material. I take that and I make it to the company. So again, it's not a one size fits all. You have to be careful with that because not every single form will be applicable to every single organization. So there are forms and you do want to give your employee a letter. If you have internal HR, you want to make sure you're working with your HR person to create that letter that tells the person if they're laid off. If they're furloughed, you want to have an estimated time frame that you put in there of when they may be returning to work. So yes.
Great. How do I discipline a remote worker? I think you touched on this.
Yeah, I did. First, take a look at what is the disciplinary action. If you don't have a form that's already in place, I'd highly recommend having like a performance counseling report. What that does is it allows you to document on a form what it is that's taking place. This is what occurred. Make sure you have the facts in place. A lot of times you want to have a conversation first. Ask the employee, okay, this is what I saw. Let's say that they're not clocking in. You want to make sure you have systems when they're working from home, that you have something that tracks or at least says, hey, my employee clocked in at 8 and they were done at 4, they took an hour lunch. Now, again, I'm referring to non-exempt employees that are eligible for overtime. If you're exempt, it's what work is getting done. You know, your performance shows in that. But an employee can be disciplined. You would want to have a conversation. First, have that open dialogue. Let them know what the concerns are. Then from there, don't always make a decision right then and there. If you do need to discipline, because sometimes you have to step back, evaluate the details I gave you. Look, was there disciplinary actions before? And then take the next step and then decide what type of disciplinary action needs to happen if in fact it does.
Okay. Michael, I think this one's more for you. When we lay off a worker, do I have to cut a check immediately when we let them go?
Yeah, no, it's here in Arizona, you certainly can if you want to, but you would just have to make that, pay them on their next check date. So if today's Thursday, if they were supposed to get paid tomorrow, then you would pay them tomorrow. If their original check date was next Friday, then you have until next Friday to pay them. Correct, Michelle?
Yeah, there is a lot of business practices, 3 days from the term date. There's always been that, but it usually, unless there's a time period, and I apologize, I've gone blank on that, and I believe it is no more than 7 days, which sometimes does hit that. It's an old law that's been there, so you actually want to take a look. There has been confusion back and forth, and I do apologize. I've just completely gone blank on what that time frame is.
Okay, this is another one for Michelle. Do you have any ideas or resources on how to build a reopen plan? Is there a guide of any kind available?
Great question. I don't have a direct answer because I'm in the middle of that, of creating some safety procedures and steps in place for companies that are going back, that have either been working from home or have shut down completely. I'm utilizing a lot of resources, as I kind of mentioned, only because this is where I get a lot of my material, is either through various council as well as SHRM.org, because they're kind of at the top of what advocates for employers when it comes to the HR world. So a lot of the resources is where I'm gathering from there, but there is a lot of material that is currently available, and also we are starting to put some stuff together.
So you're talking about that from an HR side. I do want to chime in on this question for on behalf of my fellow colleagues with the chambers as well. If you are looking for industry specific, like if I'm a spa, or if I'm a massage therapist, or if I offer services, or if I'm a restaurant, there are guidelines in conjunction with the CDC as well as Maricopa Health, Arizona Health Services, that we have put on our business resource page from that perspective on that. And many of them are industry specific, as well as we also have some resources there that link to the federal guidelines on reopening businesses. So if you want HR specific, Michelle's the resource on that component, but if just overall in general on how to open business, that's it. This one I think is for Paula. Does the 25% for rent utilities only cover 8 weeks? Or can I prepay for the rest of the year to utilize the entire 25%?
It's expenses for those 8 weeks. So those expenses that are due in that 8-week time frame.
Okay.
Yeah. Terry?
Uh-huh.
Sorry, just for some quick clarification on the question with regards to the employee's pay. So here in Arizona, of course, it varies by state, but if the employee is terminated within 7 work days or the end of the next pay period, whichever is sooner, is when you would pay them. If the employee quits by the next regular payday and by mail if requested, and then if an employee were to die, to the employee's surviving spouse up to $5,000 when they present the affidavit. So just for some clarification on that.
Yikes, more government red tape.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there changes that could occur on the forgiveness application, such as the inclusion of bonuses that are not currently listed as payroll cost. Paula, I think that one's to you.
Could you say that one again?
Sure. Are there any changes that could occur on the forgiveness application, such as the inclusion of bonuses that are not currently listed as payroll cost?
I did not see anything in that current application released and have not heard anything from our SBA contact that has indicated that. So
okay,
I would veer away from that.
Okay, next one. My business was hit hard and will take a while to recover. In the meantime, the commercial lease is due and I'm not able to pay after PPP runs out. Is there any other resources I can turn to? Is requesting to cancel the commercial lease a good idea?
Well, that one is that one me again, probably?
Probably.
Yeah, restate. Yeah, restate it again. It's a long one. Give it to me again, Terry.
My business was hit hard and will take a while to recover. In the meantime, the commercial lease is due. I am not able to pay after the PPP runs out. Is there any other resource that I can turn to?
That I am not sure of the answer of that.
Okay.
All I can say is there are other organizations out there, like some chambers, that are offering their own loans, you know, grants, those type of things. So check with local organizations, banks, to see if they're offering any type of, you know, special micro loans that are designed for businesses that are hit hard by the pandemic. That would be my advice.
And those are based upon the community in which you live, and the cities. Some of the cities are partnering with their chambers on that. So, and then the final on that particular one, is it requesting to cancel the commercial lease a good idea? And this is what we've been telling. We've had a couple of conversations at the Chandler Chamber with some of our landlords. And recommendations, number one, open up that conversation. Just be very honest with your landlord. Landlords don't want to have to help to refill backspace if you leave. It's much more difficult to do that in these times. So talk to them, see if you can work out plans, see if there's other options that are available. Can you add that on if the landlord's in a position that they can add that on to the end of your lease? Currently, evictions through the Governor Ducey's executive orders, there is a stay on evictions through the end of this month. We don't anticipate any extensions on that at this time, but my recommendation would really be to open up that conversation with your landlord and just start talking about that and what can be done. Is there a way that you could, you know, negotiating tools such as, do you have too much space? Can you downsize? And it depends on what your circumstances are, but there are options there. All right, Paula, this is another one for you. Has there been any discussions about how business with government contracts impacted by COVID will be handled?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Was there more to it?
Yeah. For
Okay.
example, my business has 2 years into a 5-year contract with a city entity. Is there a possibility the contract term get extended to accommodate for the downtime?
No, I have not heard any information in that area, so that I do not know.
I do know that we had a number of businesses, all of my chamber colleagues, we have been on a couple of calls with the governor's office. This did come up as a matter of contracting with the state, if they would take a look at this. Again, I would go back to that city and find out what I think each of the individual cities or municipalities are handling them in their own ways. So I would make that suggestion there. Okay, other questions coming in? Let me make sure I got all the ones that we've had here. I have one that has come up on additional webinars that we've been on. And this is more kind of for Michelle, I think. With the additional right now in stipend in unemployment, right now they get that through July 31st. Some workers are not wanting to come back because they're making more on unemployment, or because of the fear or whatever the case may be. Can you address that a little bit?
Yes, I can, because I'm living it every day right now, probably. I think I get that question both from friends as well as many of my clients. And the biggest part is what they don't realize: if the employer is requesting the employee to come back and the employee is refusing because of XYZ, the employer can, at that point, say, okay, you know, in order to operate, we still need to move forward. Therefore, it could be if they have nothing related to any ADA or concerns related to that, or their child care is back, but they're just not wanting to come back because they're just scared, the employee then is resigning. So what happens is they're playing a game of chicken, really. They're taking a risk of losing their unemployment. So what they don't realize is the employee doesn't realize that at this point, if I refuse, my employer can report to unemployment that they were given an offer. And if the employee puts on unemployment when they report weekly and say, no, I wasn't given an offer or an opportunity for a position in those various questions, it could be considered potentially fraud. So they have to be cautious that the fact that they could potentially lose their unemployment if an offer's there. So we do highly recommend that employers are actually given not just a verbal, but a written letter to the employee that says your position is being offered to come back to work, or something that tracks that. Then if the employee refuses it, then they want to document that it's refused, and then they want to report that to unemployment. The other thing too, though, is this area that if the employee refuses it but says, I don't have childcare, the child care that my child goes to is not open, you want to make sure, do they still have time under the expanded FMLA that they could be protected under? So don't just immediately say no, and we're going to. Right now, I've had that situation where somebody, two managers were fired for not returning back to work, which is probably not the smart decision because they didn't ask the other questions.
Okay.
So Terry, could I chime in on that as well, related to the PPP loan?
Perfect.
In that application for forgiveness, in that documentation listing, it specifically lists written proof of that offer and the decline. So if you have a PPP loan, you absolutely need to follow what Michelle's talking about, is that documentation, because it will be asked for.
Great. So, and this question this came up on another call that I was on, and sorry, Michelle, not to keep hitting you.
Oh, no, it's okay.
How do we handle workers' compensation in a home environment?
That's a great question, because even before this, you know, we have those that come up where employers, even when somebody says, hey, I need to take some temporary time, but if their position allows them to work from home, one, you want to kind of put some type of job description or letter in place that lets them know this is a temporary, this is a temporary time that you can work from home. Also, you want to put some guidelines in that letter that also identifies what is protected under workers' comp. So make sure, again, we're referring to Arizona. Arizona has to have workers' comp, but if you're an organization that also has companies in other states, look at the state law when it comes to those workers' comp. Because things like, if they were, let's say they were taking care of their child during that time and the kid fell, and then the mom or dad turned around and tripped and fell, is that considered workers' comp? So again, it's going to be based on what's the circumstances. Were they working? Was it tracked that they were working at that time? Because not everything in the home also identify the area that's their working space. So them walking to the kitchen and they're making brownies and they're not on work time, they're on their lunch, but technically their work areas in their office, it's identified. Those may be two different things where workers' comp may say this is not covered. They're gonna want evidence. So you wanna make sure that all that is trackable. So a case by case, but you have to look at your workers' comp policy as well when it comes to remote working.
Okay. Does the employer have to offer a stipend for remote employees using personal equipment?
No, there's not a required federal, some states may have some things, but I know that I don't believe in Arizona, there's not a requirement of a stipend. Employer can request, say, look, we want to, it's probably a good practice if they're using it, but do they have to? Not necessarily, but then if the employer doesn't provide the resources of the company one, so you want to stay away from giving a stipend, especially for laptops, things like that, and say you can use your personal one, we're going to give you a dollar amount. You're though risking the company's information, hacks, stuff like that, because they're using their personal computer. You also deal with harassment, discrimination, things like that that come into play. So even though they don't have to give a stipend, I would highly recommend that the employer is providing the company resources for them to use, not the employee using it, requesting, can I get $20 or $100 for buying my own computer and utilizing my own Wi-Fi and things, stuff like that. So they can use Wi-Fi, but you also want to make sure in those letters that it identifies what they can and can't use and what things belong to the employee.
Okay. So a follow-up with that particular stipend question, and Michael, this goes to you. Is that then, do you have to list that stipend on their paycheck, or is that listed as an expense?
Well, I would definitely list it and call it clearly what it is. That way it's clearly defined on their check. That way when they see that stuff, there's no confusion as to what it is, because theoretically it will potentially go away. And you don't want that employee to call into question the fact that they weren't getting it or what have you. So that's all. I don't know that there's anything that's been clearly defined, but I would say that's absolutely best practice.
Great. If an employee is sent out for COVID testing, do we have to pay them while they are waiting for results?
So the employer, so if the question is if the employer is sending them for the testing, the answer is yes.
Yes.
If the employee has some potential, like is experiencing some symptoms that may be related to COVID, they are going out and the doctor's getting them tested. The part that is yes is because of the emergency sick pay. So that piece, because it's related to COVID, would still be a yes.
Yeah.
All right. What if an employee refuses a temperature check?
If it's being required by the company for business purposes where the company can show that it's related to, we're following CDC guidelines, and with that, your position or the company in general, the exposure, the involvement with customers could pose potential risk with the coronavirus, then they would have to comply with the temperature check. So the employer can enforce that. They just got to have reason to why that's related to that.
Okay. Another question. We had a situation where an employee that asked for reduced hours as of January 1 in order to make more time to run a personal business, and the business they own no longer is producing because of COVID. This employee filed for unemployment on our business, even though this employee has been working this whole time according to the agreed upon hours in January. How does this work?
The employer should have, if they didn't, and there's a time frame, they actually should have contested that with unemployment to show that the employee did have, and again, they have to base it on their part that they weren't working, but that there was work available and they weren't working full-time because they were doing their other job. If they haven't, they can still try to contest it. They can write a letter to the unemployment. If it's past the 15-day notice that says on the letter, I have done that. And sometimes unemployment will take the case and do a hearing on that.
Okay. And they're stating that it was contested.
Was contested? Have they? Okay. And I don't know if unemployment denied it and they the employer and the employee still won. Ultimately, that's kind of where the decision comes in with unemployment.
Okay.
Oh, I can add a little bit to that. Arizona is what's considered a proportional charging method for unemployment, which basically says all the employers in the claimant's base period are charged in proportion to the amount of wages that the employer paid the claimant during the base period. So if the claimant worked for a single employer during the base period, the entire claim would be attributable to that employer. If the employee worked for multiple organizations during his base period, each organization will be charged proportionally for the claim. So for example, if an employee only earned 50% of his base period wages while working for your organization, then only approximately 50% of the entire claim will be charged to your account. So it's going to depend on the time period, and then how much money was paid via his own business, and then how much was paid via the other. So they may have to pay, it would just be a portion of it as opposed to the whole thing.
Okay. Does the employer have to provide chairs and equipment for somebody to work remotely?
No, they don't have to, but what's going to happen is can the employee, if they're allowing the employee to work from home and the employee cannot operate because they don't have the right equipment, chairs, that might be kind of an iffy, you know, but the equipment, like if they don't have a computer, the employer's telling them they need to work from home, then the employer should be providing it, right? If the employee cannot afford it. But because then what the other part is, and due to right now with what's going on, is that if the employer says, well, if you can't provide that, then what happens is either they furlough or they lay the employee off during that time. Then, of course, then the employee would go and file for unemployment. So you have that other part, and then if they were part of the PPP, they have to then, you know, kind of show, are they keeping employees working, and what are each of those? So do they have to provide it? Not necessarily, but if they don't, how would the employee be able to operate? So they have to look at it as, are they requesting it, or are we allowing it, but then putting it on the employee?
All right. We had we've been doing these roundtable groups, and we had a similar situation that came up with one of our call centers, and the employee wanted them to pay for Wi-Fi because they said that they didn't have Wi-Fi in their home. So instead, the employer, because there's very little people working in the office, they can absolutely social distance and everything else, that they made an offer for that employee to come in and sit in. I think there's a total of 5 people in that building. So
be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, and that's a good thing that they did that, because then it shows, okay, if we can't, Wi-Fi is one of those. You don't see it too often where employees, when they're at home, that they don't have the resource. It does, but I know in multiple situations of several things that I've seen come up, it's been very rare where someone doesn't have that type of accessibility, because the Wi-Fi is not just for the, you know, to operate. They could use Wi-Fi for other purposes. So again, that's where that restriction and being cautious with security breaches and hacking and stuff like that, because they could be utilizing it for other purposes.
Which, Paula, that leads to a question. Is Wi-Fi considered broadband? Is that considered a utility on PPP or EIDL?
Some of the details are not provided about the definition of utilities. So we're going back to those generally kind of accepted accounting principles of what the utilities are. I believe internet is included in that.
Okay.
But check with your accountant on that. Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters. You have been absolutely, every time a question's answered, 3 more come up. So I really want to thank each one of you for your areas of expertise. Next week, we are going to have a panelist who is a CPA that's going to talk about, because now that the deadlines have been extended for filing to July 15th, what has happened, as well as how do you record that PPP and the EIDL and your overall taxes, whether it's personal or your business taxes. So, and as well as we're going to have Paula join us and give us weekly updates, because this keeps changing on all of these programs. And so I appreciate that. Thank you, Michael Garza with Payroll Control Systems, for your expertise, as well as Michelle Gray with Integra HR. I do want to do a shout out to my fellow chamber colleagues and their support. And so if you have questions on any of these, contact your local chamber. They are ultimate resource. They have a number of resources for you. So thank you, Ahwatukee, Apache Junction, Carefree Cave Creek, Chandler, Fountain Hills, Gilbert, Queen Creek, and Tempe Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us today.